A wooden chair with a worn seat sits near the door, its back straight and its armrests darkened by the oils of many hands. Beside it, a low table of scrubbed oak holds a shallow basin of glazed earthenware and a clean linen cloth folded into a neat rectangle. On the wall beside the window, an iron hook supports a long strip of leather, dark and supple from years of use, hanging straight down with a loop at the top. This is the strop. The leather has a deep chestnut color that lightens only slightly along the edges, where the nap has become smooth from countless passes of steel. It hangs there motionless, waiting, and in the quiet of the early morning it is the first thing the eye settles upon because it seems to hold the purpose of the entire room. The barber surgeon himself is already present, a quiet man in a plain woolen coat with sleeves rolled to the elbow. He moves without haste, his footsteps a series of soft thuds that the old wood absorbs. He reaches up and lifts the strop from its hook with one hand while supporting its length with the other, then steps back into the center of the room where the light is gradually strengthening. Running his palm along the full face of the leather, he checks for any grit that might have settled on the surface overnight, or any curl that a change in the air might have introduced. His hand moves slowly from the top loop down to the very end, and his fingertips read the texture with a familiarity that needs no thought. Finding the leather clean and flat, he carries the strop to a peg set into the wall near his work table, a peg worn shiny from years of the same small ritual. He hooks the top loop over it, lets the length fall, then bends to tie the bottom end loosely to a ring fixed in the wall just above the baseboard. A short cord of braided hemp is passed through the ring and the strop's lower hole, and he pulls the knot snug but not tight, adjusting the tension with a few small tugs until the leather stands slightly away from the plaster, offering a firm but slightly yielding surface. He steps back to regard it, head tilted just a little, then gives the cord one more half-hitch and nods to himself, a barely perceptible gesture that concludes the first step of the morning. Now he turns to a small wooden box that rests on a shelf beneath the table. The box is made of beech, its corners dovetailed, its lid fitted with a simple brass catch. He sets it on the folded cloth and opens it, revealing an interior lined with faded green felt. From this protective bed, he lifts out two instruments. The first is a Fleam, its casing of polished brass oval in shape, with a small release catch on the side. Inside the casing rest three folding blades of different widths, each pivoting on a tiny steel pin. He does not open the blades yet. He simply sets the Fleam on the cloth, where the brass gleams softly in the growing daylight. The second instrument is a lancet, slenderer and simpler, its blade no wider than a goose quill at the base and tapering to a point so fine that it nearly vanishes against the cloth. The handle is of smoothed horn, a material that has absorbed the warmth of the same hand over many years, and its surface bears a low sheen from contact with skin. He places the lancet beside the Fleam, aligning them parallel to each other and to the edge of the cloth. He then pulls a small wooden stool close to the wall where the strop hangs, and from a shelf takes down a pottery pot no larger than a child's fist. Inside is a dressing paste he made himself, a mixture of fine abrasive powder and tallow, blended with a very small amount of beeswax to give it body. The paste has the color of weak tea and the consistency of soft butter, and it smells faintly of animal fat and dust, a smell that is not unpleasant but simply old and practical. Seating himself on the stool, he places the pot on the table beside the cloth and dips 2 fingers into the paste, taking up only as much as clings to the skin after a light touch. He leans toward the strop and begins to apply the dressing to the leather, starting near the top and working downward. His fingers move in slow circles, each circle overlapping the one before, covering a strip about the width of his hand. The paste sinks into the pores of the leather immediately, turning the surface from a dry matte to a subdued gloss, and the room fills with the soft repetitive sound of skin sliding against hide. He works methodically, section by section, leaning forward and back as he covers the entire usable length of the strop. When he reaches the bottom, he straightens, checks his work by sight, and then uses the flat of his palm to rub the dressed leather with long, even strokes that further press the paste into the surface. The motion is unhurried, almost hypnotic, and the strop begins to take on a uniform matte sheen, the kind of finish that speaks of careful and patient preparation. The light from the window, now strong enough to show the grain of the wooden floor, catches the slight change in the leather's texture, revealing tiny lines that run parallel from top to bottom, the natural signature of the hide. While he works, the town outside stirs to life in a series of muted, distant sounds that drift through the cracks around the door and the loose lead joints of the window. A cart passes on the cobbles a street away, its wheels a low thunder that you feel in the soles of your feet rather than hear as a distinct noise. A dog barks twice in a courtyard and then falls silent. The church bell in the market square sounds a single note, not yet the call to prayer, but simply a marker of the hour, and the note hangs in the air for a long moment before dissolving into the general quiet. Inside the shop, the only sounds are the soft friction of the barber surgeon's palm on leather and the occasional creak of the floorboard overhead, as someone in the dwelling above stirs from sleep. These sounds are so gentle that they blend with the rhythm of your own breathing, and after a while you cease to notice them as separate events, perceiving them instead as the continuous hum of a morning that holds nothing urgent. The barber surgeon finishes dressing the strop and wipes his fingers on a rag that has been folded beside the paste pot. The rag is a square of old linen, soft and grayed from washing, and he uses it to remove any excess paste from his skin before returning the pot to its shelf. He then stands, steps back from the strop, and fixes his gaze on its surface for a long, still interval. The kind of inspection that is not critical, but simply confirmatory, a habit formed over the course of a lifetime. Satisfied, he turns to the cloth where the Fleam and lancet lie, and picks up the Fleam first, holding it in his palm as if weighing it. The brass casing is cool to the touch, and he turns it over once, running his thumb across the release catch without pressing it. The Fleam has been with him for many years, made by a cutler in the next county who has since passed on, and it bears the faint scratches of a well-used but carefully kept instrument. He places his thumbnail into the groove of the catch and pushes gently, and the first blade folds out with a tiny click that you hear only because the room is so still. The blade is a crescent of bright steel, a half-moon shape with a bevel that glimmers along its entire curve, and it locks into place with a stubbornness that speaks of a good, tight fit. He holds it up to the light, turning it so that the edge catches the glow from the window and then folds it back into the casing, repeating the same small set of movements for the second and third blades, each one a different width, each one shining and ready. After he has checked all three blades, he closes the Fleam and sets it back on the cloth, then reaches for the lancet. He lifts it by the horn handle with the same quiet care you might use to lift a sleeping bird. The blade is straight and slender, and he wipes it with a corner of the linen cloth, even though it is already clean, a gesture that seems more about readiness than necessity. He then holds the lancet near the window and peers at its point with one eye half closed, confirming that no burr or dullness has appeared since the last time it was used. The inspection takes only a moment, and then he places it back beside the Fleam, aligning it exactly as before. The next thing he does is to walk to the door, which stands ajar, and look out into the street. You cannot see what he sees from where you stand, but you can perceive the slight change in the light that enters as he opens the door a little wider, a shift from indirect to direct on the threshold. A breath of cooler air wanders in, carrying with it the smell of damp stone and the faint sweetness of distant wood smoke, and it twines around the room for a few seconds before settling. He remains there for perhaps a dozen heartbeats, his hand resting on the iron latch, and then he lets the door fall gently back to its ajar position and returns to his stool. The street outside is not a source of distraction for him. It is simply another part of the morning to be noticed and then set aside. Now he sits once more before the strop, and this time he picks up the Fleam and unfolds the widest of the three blades, the one used most often for the simpler bleedings. He rests the heel of the blade flat on the top of the strop, tilting it just slightly so that the bevel makes full contact with the dressed leather. He begins to draw it toward himself with a motion that starts in his shoulder and travels down through his elbow and wrist, a continuous steady pull that produces a low, whispering sound. At the end of the pass he lifts the blade, returns it to the top, and repeats the motion, establishing a rhythm that is as even as the ticking of the long case clock that stands in the corner. After a number of passes that he counts under his breath in a murmur so faint you cannot catch the numbers, he turns the blade over and works the other side, rocking it carefully over the spine so that the edge never rolls against the leather. The whispering sound changes in timbre, becoming a little softer on the second bevel, and the dim light from the window plays along the length of the steel as it moves back and forth. The Fleam is sharp already, but he treats this morning's stropping as the foundation of the day's readiness, an act more of maintenance than of correction, and so he continues without hurry, his gaze fixed somewhere between the blade and the window, his thoughts clearly turned inward to a place of quiet repetition. The morning stretches on in this manner, the shop filling gradually with a warmth that rises from the boards and the plaster, the sun climbing higher until its light reaches the very foot of the strop. You find that your own attention has softened, that you've become a part of the stillness, watching the steady hand, the unwavering leather, the slow arc of the blade, and you understand without being told that the day ahead will be exactly like this. A sequence of small familiar motions performed with care, waiting for the next patient who may or may not come, but whose absence is never a source of concern. The barber surgeon stops briefly to wipe the blade on the linen rag, then unfolds the medium blade and begins the same series of passes, and the shop remains a place where time moves only because it must, not because it wants to. The leather strop has become the quiet center of the morning, a strip of darkened hide stretched between wall and ring that draws your eye every time the barber surgeon pauses in his work. You have been standing in this narrow shop long enough for the stiffness of early waking to leave your legs, and now you find that your attention settles on the strop as naturally as dust settles on a sill. There is something in its texture that invites a long, slow-looking, a surface so familiar to the man who uses it that he reads it without conscious effort, yet a surface that to you reveals layer after layer of detail the longer you regard it. The leather is not uniform, though it might appear so at a glance. It bears the marks of its making and its years, and each of those marks tells a small part of the story that the barber surgeon already knows by heart. He reaches out now and runs the flat of his thumb across the strop, beginning just below the top peg and drawing downward in a single unhurried stroke. The motion is not a test so much as a greeting, a way of renewing acquaintance with the material after the few minutes he spent away from it while tending to the Fleam blades. You watch his thumbnail travel along the grain, and you notice that the leather is not perfectly smooth, but covered in a fine network of tiny lines, the natural pores that once allowed the hide to breathe when it was still part of a living animal. Those pores have been compressed over time by stropping and by dressing, but they remain faintly visible, a map of the original skin that the tanner preserved rather than erased. The barber surgeon's thumb passes over them with a familiarity that suggests he has felt that same topography thousands of times, and he nods to himself almost imperceptibly, satisfied that the leather has held its tension through the change from night to day. He shifts on his stool and turns his attention to the edges of the strop, running a finger along the left side and then the right. The edges are cut straight and finished with a light burnishing that smooths the rawhide into a rounded bead, preventing any fraying or curling that might interfere with the passage of a blade. Where the edge meets the dressed face, there is a very faint ridge, the result of decades of stropping wearing down the center while leaving the margins slightly higher, and it is this ridge that the barber surgeon now examines with a quiet, practiced eye. He presses it gently between thumb and forefinger, tracing its length from top to bottom, and finds it acceptable, neither too pronounced nor too faint, a sign that the strop is wearing evenly and will continue to serve well for years yet to come. His inspection moves to the bottom of the strop, where the short cord of braided hemp passes through a small brass eyelet. The eyelet is a simple ring, tarnished to a deep brown, and it has been set into the leather by a saddler long ago who used a small punch and a hammer to make a clean hole. The cord passes through the eyelet and then around the iron ring set into the wall, securing the strop under a light tension that can be adjusted by loosening or tightening the knot. The barber surgeon tests the give of the cord with a gentle tug, and the leather responds with a slight spring, firm but not rigid, exactly as he prefers it. He remembers, in the unhurried way of a man who has nothing to hurry toward, the time he replaced the old cord after it had worn thin from rubbing against the ring, a task that required him to trim a fresh piece of hemp, pass it through the eyelet, and tie a new knot with 3 turns and a loop, just as he had been shown as an apprentice. That cord has now lasted 3 winters, and it still holds well enough that he leaves it alone and straightens to address the main surface once more. The light from the window has shifted by now, creeping further across the floor and reaching the very base of the wall, where a thin line of dust lies undisturbed. The new angle catches the surface of the strop in a way that reveals the subtle variations in its color, a deep chestnut that lightens to a warmer amber where the dressing paste has not been applied quite as thickly. Near the top, where the barber surgeon's hand repeatedly lifted and returned the blades, the leather is slightly darker, burnished by the constant friction of the spine and the heel, a gentle polish that has developed over years and that cannot be replicated by any dressing. Near the bottom, where the passes end, the surface is a little rougher, the nap less compressed, and the difference between these two zones is a thing he notices only in passing, a familiar feature like the creak in the third floorboard or the slight warp in the window frame. He stands now and steps closer to the strop, bringing his nose within a few inches of the leather. The scent that rises from it is a blend that you can catch even from where you stand, a mild animal musk that comes from the hide itself, mixed with the faintly oily note of the tallow dressing and the drier, almost dusty smell of the abrasive powder that was ground into the paste. Beneath these, there is another scent, the ghost of old steel, a metallic tang that has been pressed into the leather by the countless passes of Fleam and lancet, and the combination is not unpleasant, but rather grounding, a smell that speaks of age and use and quiet care. He inhales once, a slow breath that fills his chest, and then steps back, finding nothing to concern him, nothing that requires correction. The next part of the routine is something he performs once a week, and today happens to be the day. He goes to the shelf and retrieves a small glass bottle with a cork stopper, a bottle that contains neat's foot oil, pale yellow and clear, pressed from the bones and feet of cattle, and known among leatherworkers for its ability to keep hide supple without darkening it too strongly. He pulls the cork with a soft pop and tips the bottle against a clean corner of the linen cloth, allowing a single drop to fall onto the fabric. That drop spreads slowly, a tiny circle of oil that darkens the linen and releases a scent that is faintly sweet and fatty. He records the bottle and returns it to the shelf, then picks up the cloth and folds it so that the oiled spot is on the outside, ready to be applied. Beginning once again at the top of the strop, he rubs the oiled cloth into the leather with small circular motions, working across the width in overlapping passes. The oil goes on very thinly, barely more than a film, and the leather drinks it in slowly, its surface darkening by no more than a shade. The motion of his hand is slow and even, and the sound it makes is a soft, steady susurrus, a whisper that fills the room as the only active sound. He works his way down the strop inch by inch, replenishing the cloth with another drop when the first has been fully absorbed, and each section receives the same unhurried attention. When he reaches the bottom, he pauses, wipes the cloth across the edge, and then begins again from the top, this time with the dry side of the cloth to remove any excess oil that might remain. This second pass is faster but still careful, and the leather emerges with a subdued glow that is not shiny but rather healthy, pliable, ready. He steps back to let the oil settle, folding the cloth and placing it beside the basin. While the strop rests, he turns his attention to the 3 blades of the Fleam, which still lie on the cloth beside the lancet, their brass casing catching the light. He picks up the Fleam and unfolds the widest blade once more, the same crescent that he had worked earlier, and you think he means to strop it again immediately, but instead he simply holds it near the window and turns it slowly, examining the bevel under the strengthened morning sun. The edge is still clean, still true, but he knows that the lightest touch of skin oil or a stray draught of damp air can begin a microscopic dulling, and so he will give it a few more passes on the oiled strop to fix the edge at its very best. He seats himself once more, settles the strop by giving the lower cord a tiny tug, and lays the heel of the Fleam blade flat near the top. The first pass is slower than any you have yet seen him make, a deliberate draw that pulls the edge across the leather at exactly the angle of the bevel, and the sound it makes blends with the quiet creak of his stool and the distant murmur of the town. He draws the blade toward him, lifts it, returns it to the top, and draws again, counting under his breath in a monotone that rises and falls so subtly you cannot be sure you are hearing it at all. After 12 passes, he turns the blade and works the other side, the spine rolling over the ball of his thumb with a smoothness born of long habit, and then he sets the Fleam aside and picks up the lancet. The lancet, being narrower, requires an even lighter touch on the strop, and he adjusts his grip accordingly, holding the horn handle between thumb and first two fingers as if it were a writing quill. He lays it on the leather at a slight angle, spine leading, and draws it downward with a pressure so light that the whisper it makes is barely a breath. The oiled surface of the strop grips the steel just enough to polish the very tip of the edge without wearing it down, and he performs this pass 20 times before switching sides, counting with the same distant murmur. You find that the sound of the counting, the whisper of the blade, and the steady light through the window have begun to merge into a single sensation, a kind of quiet hum that wraps around you like a blanket, and your own breathing has slowed to match the cadence of the stropping. After he has finished with the lancet, he holds it up to the light and squints, and then he does something he only does when the morning is particularly still and the mood is upon him. He takes a single strand of horsehair from a little bundle kept in a drawer, a strand that is almost invisible against his fingers, and he touches it gently to the lancet's edge, watching it part without resistance. This is an old test, a cutlass test, and it tells him that the edge is as perfect as his hands can make it. He coils the strand and puts it away, and then he returns the lancet to its place beside the Fleam with the same careful alignment as before. The strop itself, now fully oiled and used, hangs there with a quiet dignity, its surface bearing the faintest marks of the morning's work. The barber surgeon takes up the linen cloth and gives the leather one last wipe, a long stroke from top to bottom that removes any traces of steel dust or excess oil, and then he straightens and regards the whole setup with the same flat, untroubled gaze he has worn since you first entered. The strop is ready, the tools are ready, and the shop remains a place where the only urgency is the slow creep of sunlight across the floor. You notice now, because he is still for a moment, the small details of the strop that you had overlooked before. There is a tiny scar near the middle, a shallow cut, shaped like a crescent where an apprentice's hand, decades ago, slipped with a lancet and bit into the leather instead of gliding across it. The cut healed into the surface long ago, darkening to a line that is now barely visible. But it is there, and the barber surgeon remembers the day it happened, remembers the patient voice of his own master telling him to slow down, to feel the leather before moving the blade. That memory does not trouble him. It simply sits in his mind like a pebble in a stream, worn smooth by the passage of time. And then he blinks and turns away, and the memory passes, and the shop returns to its steady, patient waiting. The clock on the shelf marked the hour with a double chime, a sound that spreads through the room and fades, and the barber surgeon settles back on his stool, hands resting on his thighs, eyes fixed on the strop without really looking at it. He is waiting now, not for anything in particular, but simply because waiting is part of the rhythm, and the shop holds him in its calm like a cup holding water. You feel the weight of the stillness, the way the air has thickened slightly as the day warms, and you let your gaze travel once more along the length of the leather, from the darkened top, where the pegged loop rests, to the gently swaying end, where the cord meets the ring, and the whole of it seems to breathe very slowly, in and out, in time with something that is not quite sound and not quite silence. The Fleam rests on the folded linen cloth, with its brass casing catching the light from the window, a modest instrument that has been part of the barber surgeon's hand for so long it might as well be an extension of his fingers. You have watched him handle it already this morning, unfolding and folding the blades, giving the widest one a few passes on the strop. But now he turns his full attention to it with the kind of slow, methodical care that a scribe might give to a favorite pen. The shop is warm enough now that the faint chill of dawn has entirely gone, replaced by a settled stillness that makes every small sound distinct. And into this stillness he lifts the Fleam and holds it in his palm, as if weighing a thing of great value. The brass casing is oval in shape, fitting comfortably in a closed hand, and its surface has mellowed over years of use to a deep, subdued gold that shows no bright polish, but rather a gentle luster, the kind that comes from the natural oils of skin and the constant friction of handling. There are fine scratches visible when he tilts it toward the light, a web of tiny lines that cross each other at angles too numerous to trace, each one a record of a moment when the Fleam was taken up, used, cleaned, and put away. The casing is made of two halves, joined by a small hinge at the top, and secured at the bottom by the release catch, a mechanism so simple that it could be described in a single breath, yet so well made that it has never once failed. He runs his thumb over the catch, a small rectangular tab of brass that protrudes just enough to catch the edge of a nail, and the feel of it is so familiar that he does not need to look down. He places his thumbnail into the groove of the catch and pushes gently outward, and the first blade folds from its slot with a click so soft it is less a sound than a vibration felt through the casing. This blade is the widest of the three, a crescent of polished steel that curves in a smooth arc from the hinge pin to its very tip, and its bevel catches the light in a thin line of silver fire. The shape of it, a half-moon ground to a fine edge along its outer curve, is the result of a design that has remained largely unchanged for generations, a shape proven to open a vein cleanly without tearing the skin or causing more discomfort than is strictly necessary. The barber surgeon holds the Fleam up and turns it slowly, letting the daylight travel along the full length of the blade, and you see that the steel is not mirror bright, but has a faint watery pattern in its surface, the ghost of the folding and forging that gave it strength. The second blade, which he now unfolds by pressing the release again and rotating the first blade back into its slot while guiding the next one outward, is narrower by perhaps a third, its crescent tighter and its tip finer. This is the blade he uses for smaller veins, the ones that lie closer to the surface in the wrist or the back of the hand, and it requires a correspondingly gentler touch when sharpening. The third and last blade, coaxed out with the same quiet patience, is the narrowest of all, a sliver of steel that seems almost fragile, yet it is perfectly rigid and holds an edge that can part the thinnest skin with barely a sensation. All three blades share the same hinge pin, a tiny rod of steel that passes through the brass casing and the base of each folded tang, and the precision of the fit is such that there is no wobble, no lateral play, just a smooth rotation that moves with a slight resistance and locks into each position with a decisive little settle. Having unfolded all three blades in turn and inspected them by eye, he closes them again with a series of small movements, pressing the catch and pushing each crescent back into its protective slot until the Fleam is once more a smooth brass oval. He sets it on the cloth and turns his attention to the strop, which hangs waiting in its patient condition. The leather has by now fully absorbed the oil he applied earlier, its surface a uniform matte with just a hint of sheen, and he gives it a quick wipe with the dry linen rag to remove any dust that might have settled during the interval. Then he picks up the Fleam, opens the widest blade, and seats himself on the stool in the position he has assumed so many times that his body finds it without guidance. The stropping of a Fleam blade differs from that of a straight lancet because the crescent shape requires a rolling motion, a continuous adjustment of the wrist that keeps the bevel in contact with the leather throughout the curve. He places the heel of the blade flat near the top of the strop, the brass casing resting in his palm with the other two blades safely folded away, and he begins the first pass with a motion that starts at the shoulder and flows downward through elbow and wrist. As the blade travels along the leather, he rolls his wrist very slightly, following the crescent so that the middle of the curve and then the tip each receive their proper share of contact. The sound this makes is a soft, sustained shh that rises in pitch just a little as the tip passes and then falls silent when he lifts the blade at the bottom. He returns the Fleam to the top, resets the angle, and draws again, and the rhythm establishes itself with the steadiness of a pendulum. He works the wide blade for a full count of 20 passes, 10 on each side, pausing after the first 10 to turn the Fleam over so that the opposite bevel rests on the leather. The rolling motion is reversed now, working from the tip back to the heel, and his wrist adjusts automatically to the change in orientation. The muscles of his forearm move beneath the skin in a slow, continuous pattern, and you can see that the motion has become so ingrained that it requires no thought, no decision, just the quiet execution of a skill that was learned long ago and reinforced by daily repetition. When he finishes the 20th pass, he lifts the Fleam and wipes the blade on the linen cloth, then holds it up to the light for the inspection that always follows. The inspection is unhurried, a slow turning of the blade that lets him examine the edge from heel to tip. He looks for the tiny glints that indicate a burr, the microscopic curl of steel that can form when a blade is sharpened too aggressively or at the wrong angle, and he finds none. The edge is clean, free of any reflection that should not be there, and it narrows to a vanishing thinness that promises a quick and gentle cut. He nods, a barely perceptible dip of the chin, and then folds the wide blade back into its slot so that he can open the medium blade and begin the whole process anew. The medium blade requires a slightly different touch because its tighter crescent demands a faster roll of the wrist, but the difference is small, a matter of degree rather than method. He lays it on the strop at the same shallow angle, draws it toward him with the same even pressure, and the whisper it produces is higher and thinner, more like the sound of wind through a narrow gap than the broader sigh of the wider blade. He counts under his breath, the numbers falling in a quiet monotone that you cannot quite catch, and the counting blends with a whisper and the distant murmur of the town to form a kind of music that is almost not there. After the required number of passes, he turns the blade, works the other side, and then returns to the light for inspection, finding the edge as satisfactory as the first. The narrowest blade comes last, and it is this one that he treats with the most delicate care, holding the Fleam so lightly that the brass casing barely presses into his palm. The blade is so fine that it flexes visibly if he applies too much pressure, so his touch on the strop is feather light, the steel barely kissing the leather as it passes. The sound is nearly inaudible now, a ghost of a whisper that you feel rather than hear, and the motion of his wrist becomes a slow, careful rotation that follows the tiny crescent from heel to tip. This blade requires more passes because the narrow edge dulls more quickly and takes less steel with each stroke, and he gives it 30 on each side before he is satisfied, his counting dropping lower and lower until it merges with the general quiet. When all 3 blades have been stropped and inspected, he folds them away one by one, the clicks of the catch marking each return with a soft finality. The Fleam is once again a closed brass oval, and he sets it on the cloth while he turns his attention to a small part of the sharpening ritual that he has not yet performed today. From the shelf beneath the table he brings out a piece of scraped parchment stretched across a wooden frame, a simple testing surface that he keeps for this exact purpose. The parchment is thin and taut, its surface smooth and slightly translucent where it has been scraped to an even thickness, and it is held in the frame by small wooden wedges that can be tapped in or out to adjust the tension. He picks up the Fleam, opens the widest blade, and draws it lightly across the edge of the parchment, not slicing, but rather touching the steel to the surface at a shallow angle and pulling it through. The blade parts the parchment without resistance, leaving a clean line that opens as silently as a breath. He repeats the test with the medium blade, and then with the narrowest, and each time the result is the same, a silent parting that confirms the edges are as sharp as his hands can make them. The parchment bears the record of many such tests, a series of fine cuts that cross each other at various angles, and the pattern they make is like the map of a small, private country that only he inhabits. Satisfied, he folds the blade away, sets the Fleam down, and places the testing frame back on the shelf. The Fleam is now fully ready, its 3 blades honed to a condition that will serve any patient who might walk through the door, and yet the barber surgeon does not put it away in the felt-lined box. Instead, he leaves it on the cloth where it can be reached without delay, a sign that he expects to use it before the day is done, though he feels no urgency about when that might be. The clock ticks on the shelf, the sun inches higher, and the shop remains a place where time moves without hurry, a slow river that carries the morning toward noon at its own unhurried pace. You find that your attention has drifted during the long minutes of stropping, not away from the scene but deeper into it, as if the repetition has opened a door in your mind to a quieter room. The brass casing of the Fleam, the crescent blades, the whisper of steel on leather, the testing of the edge against parchment, all of these have become part of a single continuous moment that stretches without breaking. The barber surgeon himself seems to share this stillness, sitting on his stool with his hands resting on his thighs, his eyes moving from the Fleam to the strop to the window and back again, his expression untroubled and distant. He is not thinking about anything in particular, or if he is, his thoughts are of the same slow texture as his movements, drifting from one small consideration to the next without urgency or attachment. After a while he reaches for the Fleam once more, not because he needs to, but because his hands are accustomed to being occupied, and he unfolds the widest blade and gives it another 10 passes on the strop, a small act of extra care that will do no harm and might preserve the edge a little longer. This is the way of his whole life, a constant quiet tending that never rushes and never rests, a commitment to readiness that has become so natural he would not know how to describe it to someone who asked. The blade moves on the leather yields and guides, the light falls through the window, and the morning continues in its slow, patient turning, asking nothing of anyone, offering nothing but the chance to sit and watch and drift. The lancet lies on the folded linen cloth beside the Fleam, a slender instrument that seems almost too simple to deserve the care it receives, yet it is the tool the barber surgeon handles with the most deliberate patience of all. You have seen him lift it briefly during the morning, wiping its blade and holding it to the light, but now he turns to it with the full weight of his attention, and the shop settles into an even deeper quiet as he begins the ritual of honing this finest of his edges. The Fleam, with its folding blades and brass casing, has a certain complexity that occupies the eye, but the lancet is a single piece of steel and horn, unadorned, and its beauty lies entirely in its proportion and its purpose. He picks it up now, cradling the horn handle in the curve of his palm, where it has rested so many times that a faint polish has developed on the side that faces his thumb. The handle is carved from ox horn, a material chosen for its lightness and its ability to warm to the touch of a hand, and its color is a deep, mottled brown that shifts from near black at the butt to a translucent amber near the bolster. There are fine growth lines visible in the horn, concentric arcs that record the years of the animal it came from, and these lines catch the light in a subtle shimmer when he turns the handle slowly. The shape is a gentle curve, a flattened oval in cross-section that fits the fingers without requiring a tight grip, and the surface has been smoothed by a lifetime of handling until it feels almost silky against the skin. The bolster, where horn meets steel, is a simple brass ferrule that reinforces the joint and provides a visual boundary between the grip and the blade. It is tarnished to a dark honey color, and it bears the faintest traces of a decorative line that was cut into it by the cutler who made the instrument. A single continuous groove that circles the ferrule once and then stops. The blade itself extends from the ferrule in a straight taper that begins at the width of a goose quill and narrows gradually over a length of perhaps 3 inches until it reaches a point so fine that it seems to vanish when you look at it directly. The steel has a different character from that of the Fleam blades, a brighter and more mirror-like surface that reflects the window light in a thin white line along the spine, and the flat of the blade shows no scratches or marks from sharpening, because the barber surgeon has always used a light enough touch to preserve the original finish. He holds the lancet up to the light now, turning it slowly so that the point catches the sun and glints once, a tiny spark that appears and disappears in an instant. This inspection is not hurried. He looks at the blade from several angles, closing one eye and then the other, tilting it forward and back to see if any dull spot reveals itself as a change in the way the light slides along the edge. The edge is a barely visible line that runs from the heel just above the bolster all the way to the point, a line that is not quite a color, but rather a change in the way the surface behaves, and he reads it with the ease of a man who has been reading such lines since he was a boy, apprenticed to the old barber surgeon who taught him everything. Finding nothing to concern him, he lowers the lancet and rests it across the cloth while he prepares the strop for this most delicate phase of the morning's work. The strop has been standing ready since he oiled it and used it for the Fleam, but he goes to it now and gives it another wipe with a dry linen rag, passing the cloth from top to bottom in a single long stroke that removes any particles that might have drifted onto the surface. He checks the tension by pressing his palm flat against the leather and pushing gently, feeling the slight give and the firm return, and then he reseats himself on the stool with the lancet in his hand and the strop before him. The angle of the blade on the strop is the first and most important decision, and he takes a moment to find it exactly, laying the flat of the blade nearly parallel to the leather, but with the spine raised by no more than the thickness of a fingernail, so that only the edge bevel makes contact. The stropping of a lancet differs from that of a Fleam in one crucial respect. The blade is straight, not curved, so the motion does not require the wrist to roll, but it does require an even greater steadiness because the narrow point can dig into the leather if the angle changes by even a small amount. He begins with the near side, drawing the blade toward himself with the spine leading and the edge trailing, a motion that starts at his shoulder and flows through his elbow and wrist in a single uninterrupted path. The sound is a whisper so soft it might be mistaken for the rustle of a moth's wing, a sustained shh that lasts for the full length of the pass and then stops as he lifts the blade clear at the bottom. He returns the lancet to the top of the strop by swinging his arm back in a gentle arc, never letting the edge touch anything but air during the return, and then he makes the second pass and the third, and the rhythm of it begins to fill the room like the slow breathing of the shop itself. After 15 passes, he prepares to turn the blade to work the other side, and this is the moment that requires the most careful touch of all. He does not lift the lancet from the strop. Instead, he rolls it over the back of his thumb at the end of a pass, rotating the handle so that the spine turns away from the leather and the opposite bevel settles into contact, all without the edge ever leaving the surface. This rolling motion is performed with a smoothness that comes from years of practice, and it produces no sound at all, just a silent inversion that sets the blade ready for the return stroke. He then draws the lancet back toward him along the strop, now working the far side, and the whisper resumes with the same soft insistence. The counting continues under his breath, the numbers barely formed, a low murmur that you might mistake for a prayer if you did not know he was simply keeping track of the passes. The difference between a well-sharpened lancet and a merely adequate one lies in the very tip, the final quarter-inch of steel where the taper is at its most extreme, and it is here that he concentrates the second half of his stropping. After the main body of the blade has received its share of passes, he alters his grip very slightly, choking up on the handle so that his fingers are closer to the bolster, and he begins to work only the tip against the leather. The motion now is shorter, a series of small, precise draws that travel no more than 2 inches, and he rocks the blade over his thumb after every few passes to address each side in alternation. The whisper becomes intermittent, a soft shh that keeps time with the small movements of his wrist, and the light from the window plays along the point in a tiny concentrated star. When he is satisfied with the tip, he performs a final series of full-length passes, drawing the entire blade from heel to point along the strop with the pressure so light that the steel barely dimples the leather. These last passes are not for sharpening, but for polishing, for aligning the microscopic teeth of the edge into a single smooth line that will part the skin without any tearing, and he gives them his full attention, his gaze fixed on the blade as it moves, his breathing slow and even. After 10 such passes on each side, he lifts the lancet, wipes it gently on the linen cloth, and holds it to the light for the final inspection that will tell him whether the morning's work has achieved its purpose. The edge, when you look at it now, is a thing of great subtlety. It does not gleam or flash. It is not a dramatic thing. Instead, it shows as a very faint change in the surface of the steel, a hairline of brighter silver that runs from heel to point without interruption, fading at the very tip into a point that seems to be made of nothing but light. He turns the blade slowly, watching the edge catch the window glow, and then release it, and he nods to himself with the same almost imperceptible dip of the chin that you have seen him give to the Fleam and to the strop. The lancet is as sharp as his hands can make it, which is as sharp as it needs to be, and he lowers it to the cloth with the care of someone handling a sleeping insect. Before he puts the lancet away, he performs a small ritual that he has not yet shown you, a final test that he reserves for this instrument alone. From the same little bundle of horsehair in the drawer, he draws a single strand, pale and almost invisible, and he holds it between his thumb and forefinger so that it hangs in a loose curve. He brings the lancet up beneath the strand and touches the edge to it with no downward pressure at all, simply lifting the blade into contact, and the strand parts without a sound, the two halves falling away in a slow drift to the floorboards. This test, more than the parchment, more than the inspection by light, tells him that the lancet is ready for whatever small vein it may be asked to open, and he coils the remaining horsehair and returns it to its bundle with the same quiet economy of motion that marks everything he does. With the lancet now prepared, he wipes the horn handle with a corner of the cloth to remove any oil that might have transferred from his fingers, and then he places it beside the Fleam on the folded linen, aligning the two instruments in parallel as they were at the start of the morning. The felt-lined box still sits open on the table, but he does not put the tools away yet. Instead, he leaves them out where they can be reached, a quiet statement that the day is not over and that a patient may still come, though he feels no eagerness for that event. The strop hangs on the wall with the faintest marks of his passes still visible on the dressed surface, marks that will fade as the leather rests, and the stool creaks once as he shifts his weight and settles into a posture of waiting. You notice that the quality of the light in the shop has changed while your attention was fixed on the lancet, the sun having moved far enough across the sky to shorten the shadows and deepen the amber tone of the beams overhead. The herbs hanging from their string sway almost imperceptibly in a current of air that you cannot feel, and the scent of the neatsfoot oil has faded to a background note, part of the general smell of the room. The barber surgeon rests his hands on his thighs and lets his gaze travel from the lancet to the strop to the window and back again, his expression calm and distant, his breathing so shallow that you cannot see his chest move. He is simply present, a man who has spent the morning sharpening his tools and is now content to wait, and the room holds him in its stillness, as a hand holds water, without effort, without disturbance, without end. The barber surgeon sets the lancet down on the folded cloth with the same care he has given every object this morning, aligning it beside the Fleam so that both instruments lie parallel and still, and then he remains motionless on his stool for a long interval during which the only change in the room is the slow shift of a dust mote across a shaft of sunlight. His hands rest on his thighs, the fingers slightly curled, and his breathing has become so shallow that you cannot see his shoulders move. He is listening, though not with any obvious intent, simply letting the sounds of the shop and the street fill his awareness as they come. The clock on the shelf marks the passing seconds with its wooden tick, a sound that has been present all along, but that you only now notice because the whispering of the strop has ceased. And into this small pool of quiet the outside world begins to intrude, gently, like water seeping through sand. He rises from the stool without hurry, his movements carrying the same deliberate quality they have had since you first entered, and he walks to the door, which stands ajar by perhaps the width of a hand. The leather curtain that hangs across the upper half sways slightly as he approaches, disturbed by the small current of air that his body pushes ahead of it. He places his fingers on the edge of the door and eases it open a little wider, enough that he can stand in the opening and look out upon the market square while still remaining within the shadow of the shop. The light that enters now is brighter and cooler than the indirect glow that has been filtering through the leaded window, a clean morning light that carries with it the scent of damp stone and trodden straw, and it falls across his face and chest without reaching the deeper parts of the room. You cannot see what he sees from where you stand, but you can perceive the change in the air, and you can hear the sounds that drift in through the widened gap with a new clarity. A cart passes on the cobblestones at the far side of the square, its wheels iron-bound and heavy, and the rumble it makes is not a sharp noise, but a low continuous thunder that travels through the ground and up into the floorboards beneath your feet. The cart is laden with something that does not clatter, perhaps sacks of grain or bolts of cloth, because the sound is a single deep note rather than a rattle of many smaller parts. The driver, a figure you cannot see, calls out something indistinguishable to someone unseen, and the voice is swallowed by the distance, reduced to a rise and fall of tones that carry no words. The cart moves on, the rumble fades by degrees, and the square returns to a stillness that is not silence, but a different, more textured quiet. The barber surgeon remains in the doorway, his shoulder resting against the frame, and his gaze travels slowly across the scene outside, as if he were reading a page of a familiar book. He notes, without any great interest, the woman who walks along the edge of the square with a basket of eggs balanced on her hip, her footsteps a series of soft taps that you can just distinguish from the background murmur. She wears a plain cap and a woolen shawl, and she moves with the steady pace of someone who knows exactly how far she has to go and exactly how long it will take. The eggs in her basket are pale and smooth, and she carries them without any sign of hurry, stepping around a puddle left by the previous night's dew with the automatic adjustment of long habit. She passes by the apothecary's sign, disappears behind the bulk of the covered market cross, and her footsteps dwindle until they merge with the general softness of the morning. Above the roofline of the inn across the way, a flock of starlings has gathered on the ridge of the thatch, and they chatter among themselves in a continuous rustle of small voices. Their sound is a high, busy twittering that rises and falls in waves, sometimes louder when one bird takes brief flight and resettles, sometimes almost silent when they all pause together as if by some hidden signal. The barber surgeon watches them without moving his head, his eyes resting on the dark shapes against the pale grey of the sky. And you can see that he is not really thinking about the birds in any focused way, but simply letting their presence wash over him as part of the morning's fabric. One starling launches itself from the ridge and swoops down into the square, lands on the rim of the stone horse trough, and dips its beak into the water with a quick mechanical motion before flying back to the thatch. The chatter resumes at its previous level, a sound so continuous and so unremarkable that it soon becomes difficult to separate from the quiet itself. The breeze that moves through the square is light enough that it barely stirs the hem of the barber surgeon's coat, but it is strong enough to set the wooden signboard of the apothecary next door into a gentle motion. The sign is shaped like a mortar and pestle, carved from oak and suspended from an iron bracket by two short chains, and it moves with a slow, irregular rhythm, swinging a few inches to the left, then back to the right, then pausing before swinging again. Each movement produces a faint creak, a sound so high and thin that it barely carries across the gap between the shops. Yet it is distinct once you have noticed it, a tiny punctuation that marks the otherwise seamless flow of the outdoors. The creak comes and goes, sometimes repeated twice in quick succession, sometimes absent for so long that you forget about it until it sounds again, and the barber surgeon accepts this as he accepts everything else, without comment and without the need to investigate further. He shifts his weight from one foot to the other, a small adjustment that tells you he is not uncomfortable, but simply settling into a new posture for the duration of this pause. His eyes move to the covered market cross that stands in the center of the square, a stone structure with open arches and a pitched roof of red tiles that have faded over the centuries to a soft salmon color. Beneath the roof, in the shade, you can just make out the shapes of a few stalls that have been set up for the day's trading, though at this hour the serious business has not yet begun. A man in a leather apron unloads small barrels from a handcart and stacks them in a neat pyramid under the shelter of the cross, and the hollow thump of each barrel as it settles into place is a sound that reaches the shop with a slight delay. First the impact, then the echo off the surrounding buildings, then the silence that follows. The cooper, or whoever he may be, works without haste, stopping frequently to wipe his forehead with his sleeve and to exchange a few words with a passing figure whose voice you cannot hear. The light in the square has by now taken on the full clarity of mid-morning, a clean, pale gold that casts long shadows from the buildings on the western side and leaves the eastern side in a film of brightness. The barber surgeon observes the way the shadow of the market cross falls across the cobbles, a dark shape with sharp edges that will soften as the sun climbs higher, and he notes how the shadow of the inn's chimney extends almost to the steps of the pump. He has seen these shadows form and shift on thousands of mornings, and their pattern is as familiar to him as the grain of his strop. Yet he never tires of watching them, because they ask nothing of him and give everything they have without reservation. A dog, a small terrier with wiry brown fur, trots across the square with its nose close to the ground, following a scent that only it can perceive, and it passes directly through the shadow of the cross without pausing, its small legs moving in a quick, busy rhythm. It disappears down the lane beside the inn, and the square is empty of movement once more. The barber surgeon takes a slow breath and lets it out, and the air he exhales mingles with the cooler air from outside, creating a faint haze that vanishes almost before it forms. He turns his head very slightly to look at the window of the shop that belongs to the glover, a narrow frontage 2 doors down on the same side of the square, and he sees that the shutters are still closed, a sign that the glover is not yet ready to open for the day. He knows the glover well, a man of similar age who works with the same quiet patience, and he knows that the shutters will open around the 10th hour, when the light is strong enough to show the true color of the leathers on display. There is no hurry in this knowledge, just a simple awareness of the town's rhythms, the way each shop wakes in its own time according to its own needs. From somewhere beyond the square, perhaps from the lane that leads to the river, comes the sound of a hammer striking metal, a distant clink that repeats at irregular intervals, sometimes 3 in quick succession, sometimes a single note followed by a long pause. It is the smith at his anvil, a sound that has been part of the town's fabric for as long as anyone can remember, and the barber surgeon receives it as he would receive a familiar voice, without the need to identify it or to think about who is making it. The clinking rises and falls in volume as the breeze shifts, and between the hammer strokes the silence rushes back in, filling the gaps with a presence of its own. The starlings on the inn roof fall quiet for a moment, then resume their chatter, and the hammer sounds again, and the whole arrangement of noises forms a loose, unpaced composition that has no beginning and no end. The barber surgeon remains in the doorway for a span of time that you could not measure if you tried, because there is no sense of urgency pressing against the edges of the moment. He watches the woman with the egg basket reappear at the far side of the square, her basket now empty, her pace unchanged, and she crosses back toward the lane she came from without looking left or right. He watches the cooper place a canvas cover over his stacked barrels and weight the corners with stones from the gutter, a task performed with the same slow economy of motion that characterizes everything in this town. And he watches the light change from pale gold to a slightly warmer tone as a thin cloud passes across the sun, a fleeting shadow that slides over the square and lifts again, leaving no trace of its presence. After a while, his attention returns from the square to the immediate vicinity of the shop, and he notices that the doorstep, a single slab of worn limestone, has gathered a few dry leaves blown in from the oak tree that grows in the churchyard. The leaves are brown and curled, and they lie motionless on the stone, and he considers for a moment whether to brush them away, decides that they are doing no harm, and leaves them where they are. He looks at the iron latch of the door, a simple ring of wrought metal that has been polished by countless hands, and he sees that it is slightly loose, a fact he has noted many times before and will one day address, but not today. Then he steps back from the threshold, allows the door to fall gently to its ajar position, and returns to the interior of the shop, where the strop still hangs waiting, and the Fleam and lancet still rest on the cloth. He does not sit down immediately, but stands beside the work table and lets his eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The sounds from outside, which had been so clear and distinct while the door was wide, now return to their muffled state. The cart rumble a distant memory, the starling chatter a soft overlay that you can only just hear if you listen for it. The smith's hammer is inaudible now, and the creak of the apothecary's sign is lost entirely. But the feeling of the square remains in the room like a presence that has followed him in, a gentle awareness of the world continuing its slow turning just beyond the walls. The barber surgeon settles himself on his stool once more, picks up the Fleam and unfolds the widest blade, and the soft sound of steel on leather resumes, blending with the muted outer noises so that you can no longer tell where the sharpening ends and the town begins. The rhythm of the stropping, which had felt so steady before the pause, now seems to carry within it the echoes of everything he saw and heard at the door. The cart's low rumble lives in the long downward draw of the blade, the starling's chatter in the lighter whisper of the return, the irregular clink of the hammer in the tiny, unfelt variations of pressure that occur between passes. None of this is intentional on his part, and he would not recognize it if you pointed it out, but it is there nonetheless, the outside world absorbed into the small mechanics of his trade and transformed into a quiet, unending hum. The clock ticks, the light thickens, and you feel your own attention spreading outward and inward at once, held by the leather, the steel, the square, and the stillness that binds them all. The barber surgeon settles back onto his stool after closing the door, and the shop folds itself around him like a familiar coat. The sounds from the market square recede to a muted murmur, the starlings a distant chitter, the cart a memory of thunder, and in their place rises the nearer, smaller music of the room itself. The clock on the shelf measures out its wooden tick, a sound so steady and so patient that it seems not to measure time at all, but rather to accompany it. A quiet walking stick tapping along beside the morning. The strop hangs motionless against the wall, its surface bearing the faintest traces of the oil and the steel that have crossed it, and the Fleam and lancet rest on the cloth in their careful alignment, ready for a patient who has not yet arrived. This is the hour of waiting, the long suspended interval between the preparation of the tools and their use, and the barber surgeon inhabits it without any sign of restlessness. He has spent many thousands of such hours in his life, hours that other people might call empty or wasted, but he has never thought of them that way. To him the waiting is as much a part of the trade as the sharpening or the bleeding, a space of readiness that has its own texture and its own quiet purpose. He sits now with his hands resting on his thighs, palms down, fingers relaxed, and he lets his gaze travel slowly around the room without fixing on any one thing for long. His breathing is shallow and even, and his thoughts, if they can be called thoughts, drift in a loose, unhurried current that never breaks the surface of his calm. The lantern clock on the shelf marks the hour with a double chime, two notes that overlap slightly and then fade, leaving behind a silence that seems deeper than before. The clock is an old one, made by a clockmaker in the next town, who stamped his name on the iron back plate, and its mechanism has a slight unevenness that causes the second chime to fall just a fraction behind the beat, a tiny hesitation that the barber surgeon has noticed so many times he no longer hears it as a flaw. After the chime fades, the tick resumes, and the room returns to its steady baseline of near silence. He looks at the strop and considers giving the lancet a few more passes, not because the blade needs it, but because the motion would occupy his hands, and after a moment's reflection, he decides against it. The edge is perfect, and to strop it further without cause would be to risk wearing it unnecessarily, a small vanity that his old master had warned him against long ago when he was still an apprentice with a tendency to fuss over his work. That master, a man whose face he can still see, but whose voice has faded to a remembered murmur, used to say that a sharp edge is a thing to be respected by leaving it alone once it is done, and the lesson has stayed with him across the decades, like a pebble kept in a pocket. Instead of reaching for the tools, he reaches for the linen cloth and folds it again, taking the corner he had used earlier and turning it inward so that a fresh surface is presented on top. The folding is slow and precise, each crease pressed down with the flat of his thumb, and when he is finished, the cloth is a neat square that sits beside the instruments with its edges aligned to the grain of the table. This small act of tidiness is not necessary in any practical sense, but it satisfies a part of him that likes to see things in their proper order, and it passes a few moments of the waiting without disturbing the general stillness. The sun has climbed high enough now that its light no longer falls through the window at a slant but comes more directly, and the beam that earlier crept along the floor has shortened and brightened, illuminating a square of worn floorboards just in front of the work table. In that bright patch the dust motes turn and drift, a slow, silent ballet of tiny specks that rise and fall on currents of air too subtle for you to feel. The barber surgeon watches them without watching, his gaze resting on the column of light rather than on any individual mote, and the shifting pattern of bright and dark within the beam is a thing he has observed on countless mornings, each time slightly different, each time essentially the same. A larger speck, perhaps a fragment of lint from the cloth, drifts into the beam and catches the light more strongly than the others, glowing for a second like a tiny ember before it sails out of the sun and disappears into the general dimness. His mind, left to its own devices during this long pause, turns to the question of who might come through the door when the waiting finally ends. He does not anticipate anyone in particular, and he feels no eagerness for a patient to arrive, but the thought is a natural one for a man whose livelihood depends on the ills of others, and he lets it wander through his awareness without directing it. Perhaps the baker's wife will come, a woman of middle years who has visited him every spring for the past decade to have a little bloodlet for the headaches that afflict her when the weather turns damp. She always arrives in the late morning, her apron dusted with flour, and she sits in the wooden chair with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression one of patient endurance, while he opens the vein in her left arm. Afterwards, she thanks him softly, pays her coin, and returns to the bakehouse where the ovens are already cooling from the morning's work, and her visit is so regular that he could set the clock by it if he were the sort of man who kept such records. Or perhaps it will be the cooper, a stout man with a shoulder that aches when the barometric pressure falls, a complaint for which bloodletting offers only temporary relief, but which the cooper insists upon receiving nonetheless. The cooper talks as he sits describing the orders he has received for barrels and the price of oak staves from the timber merchant, and the barber surgeon listens with half an ear while he works, responding with the occasional nod or murmur that the cooper accepts as full conversation. The visit is never long, and the cooper leaves with his shoulder feeling looser, and his voice still filling the street outside until the door closes and the shop returns to its quiet. The barber surgeon turns these possibilities over in his mind with the same flat calm with which he handles his tools, not investing any hope or concern in one outcome over another. The waiting itself is enough. If a patient comes, he will perform his work with the same care he has always given, and if no one comes, He will pass the day in small tasks and quiet observation until the evening bell releases him to close the shop and climb the stairs to the room above. Either way, the sun will set, the night will pass, and the morning will find him here again, sharpening his tools and waiting for whoever may need him. After some minutes of this drifting contemplation, he rises from the stool and walks to the basin that sits on the low table near the door. The water in the basin is the same water he drew from the pump in the yard before dawn, and it has sat undisturbed through the morning, its surface now perfectly still and clear. He dips a corner of a small cloth into the water and wipes it across his forehead, a brief refreshment that removes no real sweat, but that feels pleasant in the warming air of the shop. He then returns to his stool, settles himself, and picks up the Fleam once more, unfolding the widest blade, not because he needs to sharpen it, but because holding the tool in his hands is a comfort, a way of anchoring his attention during the long stretch of inactivity. He does not strop the blade immediately, but simply holds it before him, studying its curve and its edge with the same absorbed attention you have seen him give to the leather and the light. The brass casing warms in his palm, and the weight of it is so familiar that he ceases to notice it, just as you might cease to notice your own breathing, unless someone draws your attention to it. After a while he does begin to strop, but the motions are slower than before, less purposeful, almost drowsy, as if the Fleam were a worrystone and the strop were the sleeve against which it is rubbed. The whisper of steel on leather becomes a soft, intermittent sound that punctuates the tick of the clock without challenging it, and the waiting continues, seamless and unhurried. The clock marks the half hour with a single chime, and the note hangs in the air for a long moment before the tick resumes. The barber surgeon folds the Fleam blade away and sets the instrument back on the cloth, then rests his hands on his thighs once more. He is perfectly still now, a figure in a painting, the muted light falling across his shoulders and the side of his face, while the shadows gather in the folds of his coat and under the brim of the stool. You feel the weight of the waiting as a physical thing, not heavy or oppressive, but dense and calm, like the pressure of deep water. The shop has become a vessel filled entirely with patience, and you float within it, suspended between one moment and the next, between the preparation and the task, in a space that asks nothing and offers only stillness in return. The afternoon has not yet begun, but the morning has already grown old, and the barber surgeon waits and the strop hangs, and the light continues its slow, imperceptible arc across the floor. The leather curtain over the doorway stirs before the barber surgeon hears any footstep, a slight inward bulge that tells him someone is approaching from the square. He lifts his head from his contemplation of the Fleam and sets the instrument down on the cloth with the quiet care that attends all his movements. Then he straightens on his stool and folds his hands loosely in his lap, ready to greet whoever may enter. The curtain parts, the iron latch clicks, and a man steps into the shop, stooping slightly under the low beam of the door frame before straightening to his full height inside the room. He is a farmer, a man of perhaps 50 years, his face weathered to a deep, ruddy brown by seasons of sun and wind, his hair the color of dried straw and cut short above his ears. He wears a smock of coarse linen over a woolen waistcoat, and his heavy boots, crusted with dried mud from the lanes, make a soft grinding sound on the floorboards as he takes 2 steps forward and then stops, as if uncertain whether he has the right to come further. The barber surgeon rises from his stool and inclines his head in a slight nod of greeting, a gesture that is neither formal nor casual, but simply the same measured acknowledgement he gives to everyone. He gestures toward the wooden chair with an open palm, and the farmer returns the nod, moving to the chair and settling into it with a heaviness that speaks of tired muscles and an ache that has been carried for some time. The chair accepts his weight with a small creak of its joints, and the farmer places his hands on his knees, palms down, and lets out a slow breath that he seems to have been holding since he left his fields. The barber surgeon does not press him to speak immediately. He returns to his stool facing the chair and waits, his expression calm and his posture relaxed, giving the man the space to gather his words. After a moment the farmer speaks, and his voice is a low rumble that seems to rise from somewhere deep in his chest, the voice of a man who is more accustomed to talking to his animals than to other people. He says that he has a heaviness in his right arm, a dull ache that has been with him for the better part of a fortnight and that seems to grow worse when the weather turns damp. He attributes it to the mist that rises from the lower meadows, where he has been cutting hay, a cold vapor that settles into the joints and stays there, and he has tried resting the arm and wrapping it in a warm cloth at night, but the relief is always temporary, and the ache returns by mid-morning. He describes the sensation with a kind of slow searching language, pausing between phrases to find the right word, and the barber surgeon listens without interrupting, his eyes resting on the farmer's face with an attention that is neither clinical nor distant, but simply present. When the farmer has finished his account, the barber surgeon asks a few quiet questions, his voice pitched low so that the farmer must lean forward slightly to hear. He asks whether the ache is sharp or dull, whether it runs down the length of the arm or settles in a particular spot, whether the hand ever feels cold or tingles at the fingers, and the farmer answers each question with the same careful deliberation, sometimes looking at his own arm as if it were a separate thing from himself that he was describing to a third party. The barber surgeon nods after each answer, and the nods are not judgments but signposts that show he is following, that he has understood, that the conversation is moving gently toward a conclusion. After a short pause during which the clock on the shelf can be heard ticking through 5 full strokes, the barber surgeon decides on the course of treatment. He explains, in a tone that is less instruction and quiet narration, that he will let a small quantity of blood from the arm to relieve the pressure and balance the humors that have become sluggish. The farmer accepts this with a single nod, his expression one of mild relief that a decision has been reached, and he begins to roll up the sleeve of his smock with the methodical movements of a man who is used to preparing his own body for work. The barber surgeon rises and goes to the work table, where the Fleam and lancet rest on their cloth, and he selects the medium blade of the Fleam, the one with the slightly narrower crescent that is suited for a vein of moderate size. He unfolds it with the same soft click you have heard several times this morning, and he holds it up briefly to the light before carrying it to the chair. He places a small wooden stool beside the farmer's chair and sets upon it the basin of glazed earthenware, a clean strip of linen, and a rolled pad of scraped lint that will serve to staunch the flow when the time comes. He then takes the farmer's arm in his hands, his touch light and impersonal, and he turns it so that the inner elbow faces upward toward the light from the window. The skin of the forearm is tanned and tough, crossed with fine lines and a few small scars from a lifetime of outdoor work, and the veins beneath it lie in a faint blue network that the barber surgeon reads with his fingertips as much as with his eyes. He chooses a vein just below the crease of the elbow, a straight section that rises slightly when he presses his thumb above it, and he nods to himself as if confirming a private judgment. Using a strip of soft linen, he ties a ligature around the upper arm, just tight enough to make the vein swell without cutting off the deeper pulse, and he asks the farmer to open and close his hand a few times. The farmer does so, his large fingers curling and uncurling in a slow, obedient rhythm, and the vein rises further, a blue line that becomes distinct against the brown skin. The barber surgeon takes a small cloth, dipped in the warm water from the kettle that has been sitting on the shelf, and he wipes the skin over the vein with a single gentle stroke, cleaning it of any dust or sweat that might interfere with the blade. The water has cooled to tepid by now, and it leaves a faint shine on the skin that evaporates slowly in the warm air of the shop. Now he picks up the Fleam and holds it in his right hand, the brass casing resting in his palm, the medium blade extended and locked. He positions himself so that the light falls over his shoulder and onto the sight, and he brings the blade close to the skin without touching it, measuring the distance and the angle with an eye that has performed this calculation so many times it is no longer a conscious act. The farmer looks away, not out of fear, but out of a kind of courteous disinterest in the mechanics of his own body, and he fixes his gaze on the strop hanging against the wall while the barber surgeon makes the single smooth stroke that parts the skin. The cut is quick and clean, and the sensation it produces is no more than the light brush of a nettle, a tiny sting that fades almost before it registers. A thin thread of dark blood wells up from the incision and begins to trickle in a slow, steady line down the curve of the arm into the basin that waits below. The barber surgeon watches the flow with a calm, detached attention, counting under his breath in the same murmur he used while stropping, and the farmer sits perfectly still, his breathing deep and regular, his shoulders dropping by degrees as the blood continues its slow exit. The room is silent except for the soft drip into the basin and the distant tick of the clock, and the light from the window falls across the scene like a gentle hand, illuminating the red thread that connects arm to vessel, the pale basin that receives it, and the quiet faces of the two men who share this small ritual. The barber surgeon has been counting all the while, a low monotone that measures the quantity of bloodlet, and when the count reaches the number he has determined appropriate for a man of the farmer's build and condition, he lifts the Fleam away and presses the rolled pad of lint firmly over the incision with his thumb. The pressure is steady and even, and he holds it there while the farmer takes a deep breath and releases it slowly. After a sufficient interval, during which the ticking of the clock marks out a full minute, the barber surgeon lifts the corner of the lint pad to check that the flow has stopped, and finding the site clean and darkening to a small seal, he secures the pad in place with a strip of linen wound twice around the arm and tied with a simple knot that will hold until evening. The farmer flexes his fingers experimentally and rotates his wrist, and a slow change passes over his face, a subtle release of tension that is almost too small to see, but that registers in the softening of the lines around his mouth and the slight unclenching of his jaw. He says that the arm feels lighter, a word he uses carefully, as if he is not quite sure it is the right one. But the barber surgeon accepts it with the same quiet nod he gives to all things, and he helps the farmer roll down his sleeve with a few gentle tugs at the fabric. The basin with its dark contents is set aside on the low table, to be dealt with later when the patient has gone, and the Fleam is wiped on the linen cloth and laid back in its place beside the lancet with the used blade still extended to remind him that it needs cleaning. The farmer rises from the chair with a slowness that suggests he is testing the arm, and finding it satisfactory, he reaches into the pocket of his waistcoat and produces a small coin, a silver sixpence worn smooth by circulation, which he places on the corner of the work table without any ceremony. The barber surgeon does not touch the coin or even look at it directly. He simply inclines his head in the same slight nod that began the visit, and the farmer returns the gesture before turning toward the door. He pauses with his hand on the latch and says something about the weather, a remark so ordinary that it needs no response, and then he steps through the curtain and back into the market square, the leather falling into place behind him with a soft slap. His footsteps recede across the cobbles, heavy and even, and within a few moments they merge with the general murmur of the town until they can no longer be distinguished. The barber surgeon stands beside the work table for a while, alone again in the quiet of the shop, and then he picks up the linen cloth and begins the slow work of cleaning, his movements as unhurried as they have been since the first light of dawn. The patient has come and gone, the arm is lighter, the coin rests on the wood, and the morning resumes its patient turning, unchanged and undisturbed. The leather curtain settles back into place behind the farmer with a soft, final slap, and the shop returns to its accustomed stillness as if the visit had never occurred. The barber surgeon stands beside the work table for a long moment, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the wood, his gaze directed toward the door, but not really seeing it. He is not tired from the procedure, which required so little physical effort that it barely registers as work. But there is a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room now that the patient has gone, a settling back into the deeper quiet that only solitude can bring. The clock on the shelf continues its steady tick, undisturbed by the small drama of blood and relief that has just played out beneath it, and the light through the window has moved another inch across the floor, marking the slow advance of the morning toward its peak. He turns from the door and walks to the low table where the basin sits with its burden of dark blood, the surface of the liquid now perfectly still and beginning to congeal at the edges where it meets the glazed earthenware. The basin is a simple piece, wide and shallow, with a small lip for pouring, and its interior glaze is a creamy white that shows the blood in stark contrast, a deep garnet that lightens to rust where it has smeared along the side during the farmer's slow bleed. Beside the basin lie the used strip of linen that served as a ligature, the small cloth that wipes the farmer's skin, and the remains of the lint pad that was pressed to the incision, all of them bearing the marks of their brief service. The barber surgeon regards these items with the same flat, untroubled attention he gives to everything, and then he begins the quiet work of cleaning, a set of motions so practiced that they follow one another without any pause for decision. He lifts the basin with both hands, careful not to tilt it, and carries it across the room to a covered wooden bucket that sits in the corner behind the door. The bucket is made of oak staves bound with iron hoops, and its lid fits snugly, keeping any smell contained. He removes the lid with one hand, while balancing the basin with the other, and then he tips the contents of the basin into the bucket in a slow, controlled pour, the blood running in a thick stream that coils against the inner wall before settling at the bottom among whatever other remnants of past procedures the bucket holds. The sound of the pour is a low glugging that lasts only a few seconds, and when the basin is empty, he tilts it further to let the last drops fall before setting it upright and replacing the bucket's lid with a firm press that seats the wood against the rim. With the basin now empty, he carries it to the rear of the shop, where a stone sink of sorts has been built into the wall, a shallow trough that drains through a lead pipe into the yard outside. Above the sink sits a pottery pitcher of cold water, drawn from the pump that morning and still cool from its journey through the underground pipes. He pours water into the basin, swirling it around so that it catches the remaining traces of blood and dilutes them from deep red to pale pink, and then he empties this into the sink as well. The process repeats twice more, each rinse removing more of the color until the water runs clear and the white glaze of the basin shows no stain at all. He dries the basin with a rough cloth kept for this purpose, a cloth that has no softness to it, but that absorbs water quickly, and when the basin is dry he returns it to its place on the low table, ready for the next patient who may or may not come. The linen ligature and the small wiping cloth are next, and he gathers them up, along with the used lint pad, and drops them into a canvas bag that hangs from a hook near the sink. The bag is the repository for all cloths that need washing, and when it is full it will be taken to the laundress who lives on the lane behind the church, a woman who boils the linens in a great copper pot and returns them clean and folded. The barber surgeon does not think about the laundress now, nor about the bag slowly filling with each procedure, but the knowledge of this system hums quietly in the back of his mind, one small part of the larger order that keeps the shop running. He then turns his attention to the Fleam, which still lies on the work table with the medium blade extended, the same blade that opened the farmer's vein. The steel bears a faint smear of blood along the bevel, a dark line that has begun to dry and darken further, and he picks up the instrument with the same care he gave it during the morning's stropping. He carries it to the sink and holds the blade under a thin stream of cold water poured from the pitcher, watching the blood dissolve and wash away in a swirl of pale red that disappears down the drain. A small brush with stiff bristles, not much larger than a thumbnail, is used to gently scrub the hinge area where the blade meets the casing, a place where dried blood could accumulate and eventually interfere with the smooth folding of the steel. The brush moves in small circles, its bristles splaying and recovering, and the water carries away whatever microscopic debris it loosens. When the blade is clean, he dries it with a corner of the fresh linen cloth, patting rather than wiping to avoid any chance of blunting the edge, and then he holds it up to the light to confirm that no residue remains. The steel gleams with the same watery pattern you observed earlier, and the bevel shows no discoloration or pitting. Satisfied, he returns to his stool and reaches for the strop, which has been hanging undisturbed since he last used it. He gives the leather a quick wipe with the dry rag, then lays the medium blade flat near the top and draws it through a series of 10 light passes, 5 on each side, to restore the edge to its full readiness after the contact with skin and the washing with water. The whisper of steel on leather is a familiar sound now, a sound you have heard so many times this morning that it has become part of the room's own quiet breathing, and the passes are performed with the same unhurried rhythm as before. After the stropping, he folds the blade back into the brass casing with a soft click, then opens the widest blade and the narrowest in turn, inspecting each one, though they were not used. The inspection is brief, a quick turn in the light to confirm that the edges remain as he left them earlier, and he gives each a single pass on the strop as a matter of ritual before folding them away as well. The Fleam is now a closed brass oval once more, clean and sharp and ready, and he places it on the felt-lined box beside the lancet. The lancet, which played no part in the farmer's visit, nevertheless receives its share of attention during the cleaning routine. The barber surgeon picks it up and wipes the blade with the oiled cloth, a thin film of oil that protects the steel from the damp air that can creep in through the window and door. He holds it near the light, confirms that the fine point is still perfect, and then returns it to its place on the felt. The horn handle is warm from his touch, and it retains that warmth for a few seconds after he sets it down, a small trace of his presence that will fade as the afternoon passes. The work table itself is the next thing to receive his care, and he takes up a dry cloth and wipes the surface in long, even strokes that sweep from one edge to the other, removing any specks of blood or water or dust that might have landed there during the procedure. The wood of the table is scrubbed oak, pale and close-grained, and it has been kept so clean over the years that it has developed a soft gleam despite never being polished. He pays particular attention to the area where the fleam and lancet rest, lifting each instrument, wiping the spot beneath, and replacing it exactly as it was. The small coin the farmer left on the corner of the table is still there, the silver sixpence worn smooth, and he picks it up, looks at it briefly, and drops it into a pottery jar that sits on the shelf. The jar is half full of similar coins, pennies and groats and sixpences, the accumulation of many small procedures, and it rattles softly as the coin settles among its fellows before returning to silence. He walks to the wooden chair where the farmer sat and checks it for any marks or stains, running his palm over the armrests and the seat. The wood is clean and dry, the farmer having bled only into the basin, and so the chair needs nothing more than a quick wipe with a cloth to remove the faint warmth that the man's body left behind. He straightens the chair on its legs, aligning it with the grain of the floorboards, and then he steps back to survey the entire front of the shop with the same quiet gaze he has used all morning. Everything is in its place, the chair ready, the basin clean, the strop hanging, the instruments aligned, and the faint smell of blood has already been replaced by the older, steadier sense of tallow soap, dried herbs, and the metallic tang of steel. The small detail catches his eye, a detail he might have overlooked if he were a less careful man. The leather strop, at its very bottom where the blade passes end, has a tiny dot of moisture that might be a drop of blood thrown from the flame when he lifted it during the procedure, or might simply be a drop of water from the rinsing. He cannot tell which, and it does not matter, but he takes up the dry cloth and dabs at the spot until the leather is uniformly matte and clean. He then runs his palm down the full length of the strop one more time, feeling the even texture and the slight warmth that the friction of his hand generates, and he finds it good. The cleaning is now complete, and the shop has returned to the exact state of readiness in which the morning began. The barber surgeon stands in the center of the room and takes a slow breath, his first deep inhalation since the farmer arrived, and then he lets it out through his nose in a quiet sigh that is not weariness or relief, but simply the body's natural punctuation at the end of a task. He walks to the shelf and retrieves the small vial of lavender oil that he keeps there, a glass bottle no larger than his thumb, and he uncorks it and touches the glass stopper to the hinge of the fleam, allowing a single tiny drop to seep into the joint. The scent of lavender, faint and dry and clean, blooms in the air for a moment and then settles, mingling with the existing smells of the shop until it is barely distinguishable. This is a small luxury, one he allows himself not out of vanity but out of a belief that the tools should be treated with more than the bare minimum of care, a belief his old master instilled in him, along with all the other quiet principles that guide his hands. He corks the vial, returns it to the shelf, and then stands for a while with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, looking at nothing in particular. The clock ticks, the sun inches higher, and the sounds of the market square drift through the door in a muted murmur that has no urgency to it. The shop has absorbed the brief interruption of the farmer's visit and has settled back into its patient waiting, as if the procedure were a stone dropped into still water and the ripples have now faded, leaving the surface unbroken. The barber surgeon feels no need to do anything else, and so he simply remains where he is, letting the afternoon approach at its own pace, his mind as clean and ordered as the room around him. The sun shifts beyond the window, a slow migration that has been underway since the first light of dawn, but that only now becomes noticeable as the angle deepens, and the color of the light begins its gradual turn from pale gold to a richer, warmer amber. The barber surgeon, who has resumed his seat on the stool after the cleaning of the shop, notices this change without remarking upon it, for he has seen it happen on so many afternoons that it has become a companion rather than an event. The beam that earlier fell in a bright square on the floorboards near the work table has stretched into a long rectangle that now climbs the opposite wall, illuminating the plaster with a glow that deepens the shadows in the corners and softens the edges of everything it touches. Dust motes still turn within the shaft of light, but they are fewer now, the air having settled with the advancing day, and they drift with a slower, more languid motion as if they too feel the weight of the afternoon. He shifts his stool a handspan to the left so that he remains within the warmth of the sun. A small adjustment that brings the light across his shoulders and the side of his face while leaving his hands in a pool of brightness that is perfect for the work of stropping. The leather strop, which has hung in its patient attitude through the farmer's visit and the cleaning that followed, now receives his attention once more, not because the blades need further sharpening, but because the rhythm of the motion is a comfort to him, a way of occupying his hands while his thoughts drift in their own unhurried current. He picks up the lancet this time, its slender blade catching the amber light and throwing a thin line of reflection onto the wall, and he seats himself comfortably before beginning the first pass. The stropping that he performs now is different in quality from the precise counting strokes of the morning. It is looser, more meditative, the blade drawn across the leather with a pressure that is just sufficient to maintain the edge without refining it further. He does not count under his breath, or if he does, the count is so internal and so rhythmless that it cannot be distinguished from the general hum of his awareness. The whisper of steel on leather is a soft, continuous sound that rises and falls with each pass, and it blends with the tick of the clock and the distant murmur of the market square to form a tapestry of quiet that fills the shop and wraps around you like a blanket that has been warmed by the sun. His mind, left free to wander by the automatic motion of his hands, turns to the subject of the seasons, a topic that occupies him often during these long afternoon stretches, when the light itself seems to invite reflection. He thinks of the dampness of autumn, which is still many months away, but which he can imagine with perfect clarity, the way the air thickens with moisture and the leather of the strop grows slightly tacky to the touch, requiring more frequent dressing with the tallow paste to keep it supple. In autumn the patients come more regularly, their joints aching from the cold and the wet, their blood sluggish and in need of balancing, and the shop is busier then, though never so busy that the barber surgeon feels hurried. He recalls the smell of autumn, the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke that drifts through the open door and mingles with the sharper notes of the vinegar he uses to clean the basin during the colder months, a small adaptation that his old master taught him when the frost began to appear on the inside of the window glass. From autumn his thoughts drift backward to summer, the season that is just now beginning to make itself felt in the warmth of the afternoons and the length of the evenings. In summer the light stays in the shop until well past the 8th hour, a slow golden fade that seems to take forever to become twilight, and the patients come less frequently because the warm weather keeps the humours in balance and the joints loose. He recalls the particular quality of summer light, how it catches the brass casing of the Fleam and makes it glow like a small sun, how it turns the horn handle of the lancet translucent at the edges, how it draws out the hidden colours in the leather of the strop, colours that are invisible in the grey light of winter. The barber surgeon has always preferred the summer, not because he dislikes the cold, but because the long days give him more time to sit in the quiet and watch the slow transformations of the light. Winter, when it arrives in his thoughts, comes with its own set of sense memories that are as vivid as the ones he holds for the other seasons. He remembers the dry cold that makes the leather of the strop stiffen overnight, requiring him to work it with his hands for several minutes before he can begin the morning sharpening. He remembers the way the window becomes etched with frost in delicate fern patterns that melt slowly as the shop warms, and the way his breath shows in small clouds when he first comes down the stairs from the room above. In winter, he dresses the strop more often, sometimes every other day, because the cold air leaches the oil from the leather faster than the mild air of spring or autumn, and he keeps the paste pot on the shelf nearest the chimney flue where the residual warmth from the hearth above keeps it from hardening. The patients who come in winter are often the same ones who come in autumn, but their complaints are sharper, the aches deeper, and he finds himself using the lancet more often than the Fleam because the veins are harder to find under cold, tightened skin. Spring, when his thoughts reach it, is the season of renewal that it has always been, a time when the town shakes off the grey of winter, and the market square fills with the bleating of new lambs driven in from the surrounding farms. In spring, the light has a clarity that it lacks in the other seasons, a clean, washed quality that makes every surface in the shop look newly made, and the barber surgeon often finds himself moving the stool closer to the window during those months, simply to bask in the brightness. The strop requires less dressing in spring because the humidity of the season keeps the leather naturally supple, and he sometimes goes a full week without reaching for the paste pot, a small economy that pleases him in an unexamined way. The patients who come in spring are a varied lot, some seeking the traditional spring bleeding that was once recommended for everyone as a way of clearing the body of the winter's accumulated sluggishness, others coming with more specific complaints that the change of season has stirred up. As these thoughts of the seasons pass through his mind, his hands continue their slow work on the strop, the lancet moving back and forth with a regularity that has become as natural as breathing. The amber light deepens around him, and the shadows on the wall behind the strop lengthen, the silhouette of the pegged loop and the tied cord extending downward until they almost touch the floor. The clock chimes the half hour, a single note that seems louder now that the shop has settled into its afternoon stillness, and the sound hangs in the air for a long moment before the tick resumes. The barber surgeon sets the lancet aside and picks up the Fleam, unfolding the widest blade and giving it a few passes on the strop, not because it needs sharpening, but because the motion is a pleasant one and he has nothing else to do. He begins to hum as he works, a fragment of an old country tune that he learned as a boy and has never forgotten, though he could not say where he first heard it or what the words might be. The melody is simple, just a few notes that rise and fall in a pattern that repeats without ever quite resolving, and he hums it under his breath in a tone so low that it barely carries beyond the immediate space around his stool. The humming blends with the whisper of the blade and the tick of the clock, adding another layer to the quiet tapestry of the afternoon. The quality of the light continues to change as the sun sinks lower, the amber deepening to a warm copper that casts long shadows across the plaster wall and makes the brass casing of the Fleam gleam like old gold. The barber surgeon notices how the texture of the strop appears different in this light, the tiny lines and pores of the leather standing out in greater relief than they did in the flat brightness of midday. The dressed surface, which earlier looked uniformly matte, now reveals subtle variations in sheen, places where the tallow paste has penetrated more deeply and places where the leather remains slightly more resistant. He runs his thumb across these variations, feeling the difference in texture as a slight change in the drag against his skin, and he files this observation away in the part of his mind that keeps track of such details, a part that never forgets but also never feels the need to act upon the knowledge. The air in the shop has cooled slightly as the afternoon has advanced, losing the warmth it held during the middle of the day, and the barber surgeon feels the change on the back of his neck where the sun no longer falls directly. He does not rise to close the door, which still stands ajar because the coolness is not unpleasant and the fresh air that drifts in from the square carries with it the sense of the late afternoon, a blend of trodden straw, distant wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the honeysuckle that grows on the wall of the inn across the way. He takes a slow breath through his nose, letting the scents register without naming them, and then he returns his attention to the Fleam, which he folds and sets aside. The lancet is next, and he picks it up and holds it before him in the copper light, turning it slowly so that the blade catches the glow and throws a tiny star of reflected brightness onto the wall. The edge is still perfect, the tip still vanishingly fine, and he nods to himself with the same slight dip of the chin that has marked his satisfactions throughout the day. He does not strop the lancet again, but instead wipes it with the oiled cloth and places it carefully on the felt-lined box, aligning it beside the Fleam with the same parallel precision that he has maintained since the morning. The afternoon light has by now climbed so far up the wall that it touches the bottom edge of the shelf where the clock sits, and the face of the clock, which is made of painted tin, reflects a warm glow that softens the numerals and makes them appear to float above the background. The barber surgeon watches this phenomenon with a quiet appreciation, noting how the light transforms the familiar face of the clock into something strange and beautiful, a small gift that the afternoon offers before it fades into evening. He has seen this happen many times, but it never loses its quiet charm, and he allows himself to enjoy it for a span of heartbeats before the sun shifts again and the glow moves on. The shadows on the wall behind the strop have lengthened further, stretching almost to the ceiling now, and their edges have softened from sharp lines to blurred transitions that shift slowly as the light continues its westward journey. The strop itself, caught between the direct light and the growing shadow, shows a gradation of color from warm chestnut at the top to deep umber at the bottom, a subtle shift that the barber surgeon notes with the same detached attention he gives to the weather and the seasons. He knows that within an hour or two the light will fade entirely, and he will rise to light the oil lamp that sits on the shelf. But for now the natural light is still sufficient and the lamp remains unlit. He rises from his stool and walks to the door, pushing it open a little wider so that he can look out upon the market square in its afternoon condition. The scene is different from what it was in the morning, the shadows having reversed their direction so that the eastern side of the square now lies in shade, while the western buildings glow in the low sun. The stalls under the market cross have been mostly packed away, the cooper's barrels removed, the egg seller long returned to her farm, and only a few figures move across the cobbles with the slow gait of people who have finished their business and are making their way home. The signboard of the apothecary creaks once, a sound that has become familiar over the course of the day and then falls silent. The starlings have left the ridge of the inn and scattered to their evening roosts, and the square is quiet except for the distant sound of a child calling to someone in a voice too far away to understand. The barber surgeon stands in the doorway for a while, not as long as he stood in the morning, but long enough to feel the evening air on his face and to note the way the sky above the rooftops has begun to take on the faintest wash of rose near the horizon. He thinks of the evening ahead, the simple meal he will prepare in the small kitchen at the top of the stairs, the chair by the hearth where he will sit until the fire burns low, the bed with its woolen blanket and its goose feather mattress that has been his for so many years, it has molded to his shape. There is no loneliness in these thoughts, no yearning for anything different, just a quiet acceptance of the evening's small comforts, and the knowledge that tomorrow will be much the same as today. He turns from the door and returns to the interior of the shop, where the light is dimmed by another increment and the shadows have claimed more of the floor. The stool waits for him beside the strop, and he settles onto it one more time, picking up the lancet and giving it a final few passes on the leather, not out of necessity, but out of a desire to feel the familiar motion under his hands as the day draws toward its close. The whisper of steel on hide is softer now, almost inaudible, and the amber light continues its slow fade into copper, and the clock ticks on, and the barber surgeon hums his tune, and the afternoon drifts without hurry toward the waiting evening. The church bell rings the hour of 6, a single low note that travels across the market square and enters the shop through the gap in the door, filling the room with a vibration that is felt as much as heard. The barber surgeon, who has been sitting on his stool with the lancet resting across his thigh, lifts his head at the sound and holds it tilted for a moment, while the note fades, counting the hour automatically in the way that all people do when a bell confirms what the light has already told them. The day has reached its appointed end, the work is done, and the time has come to put the tools away and close the shop for the night. He rises from the stool with the same unhurried motion that has characterized every movement since the first light of dawn, and he places the lancet on the folded cloth beside the Fleam, while he turns to address the strop. The leather has served him through the long morning and the quiet afternoon, receiving the blades whenever he felt the need to sharpen them, and it now hangs in the dimming light with a look of patient exhaustion, as if it too has put in a full day and is ready for rest. He runs his palm down its length one final time, feeling the familiar texture and the residual warmth from the friction of the afternoon's stropping, and he finds it in good condition, still supple, still true, bearing only the faintest traces of the oil and the steel that have crossed it since morning. He takes up the dry linen rag and wipes the entire surface of the strop in a single long stroke from top to bottom, removing any particles of metal or dust or dried paste that might have accumulated over the course of the day. The rag comes away clean, or clean enough that he does not feel the need to inspect it, and he folds it over the peg and uses a corner to get into the small space where the leather meets the top loop, a crevice that can trap grit if left unattended. Satisfied, he unties the short cord of braided hemp from the iron ring set into the wall, his fingers working the knot loose with the ease of long practice, and he lets the bottom end of the strop swing free. The leather curls slightly at the end, a gentle curve that is the result of being held under tension all day, and he smooths it with his palm until it hangs straight. He then lifts the top loop from the wall peg, supports the full length of the strop in both hands, and carries it to the iron hook beside the window where it spends its nights. The hook receives the loop with a soft click of metal on metal, and the strop hangs there now in its resting attitude, dark and still against the fading light, ready to be taken down again when the morning returns. With the strop put away, he turns his attention to the instruments that have been his companions through the hours of waiting and the brief visit from the farmer. The Fleam lies on the cloth, with all 3 blades folded away inside the brass casing, and he picks it up and holds it briefly under the light of the window, though the light is now so dim that it barely illuminates the surface. He opens the casing and inspects each blade in turn, not because he expects to find any problem, but because this final check is part of the ritual of closing, a small act of respect for the tools that have served him. The widest blade, the medium blade, and the narrowest blade all gleam faintly in the twilight, their edges clean and sharp, their hinges moving freely, and he folds them away one by one, the soft click of the catch marking each return. He wipes the brass casing with the oiled cloth to remove any moisture that might have settled on it from the air, and then he places the Fleam gently into the felt-lined box, settling it into the depression that its weight has worn into the felt over many years. The lancet receives the same quiet attention, its slender blade catching the last of the light from the window and throwing a thin line of silver onto the wall before he wipes it with the oiled cloth and holds it close to his eyes for the final inspection of the day. The edge is as perfect as it was at noon, the tip as fine, the horn handle as warm and smooth, and he places it in the box beside the Fleam, aligning the 2 instruments in the same parallel arrangement they have maintained since morning. The felt-lined box has been open on the work table all day, its contents ready for use at any moment. And now he closes the lid with a snug wooden fit that produces a soft, hollow sound. A sound of finality that is not sad, but simply complete. He runs his thumb along the edge of the lid where it meets the base, checking that it is fully seated, and then he places the box on the shelf beneath the table, pushing it back until it rests against the wall where the darkness has already gathered. The work table itself is the next to receive his care, and he takes up the cloth and whites the surface in the same long, even strokes that he used earlier in the day, moving from one edge to the other and gathering any stray particles into the cloth. The wood is clean, as it always is after a day of his quiet habits, but the act of wiping it down is necessary to his sense of order, a signal to himself that the work is finished and the table can rest. He folds the cloth and places it beside the basin on the low table, and then he surveys the front of the shop with a slow, methodical gaze that misses nothing. The wooden chair aligned with the floorboards, the basin clean and dry, the shelf tidy, the clock ticking steadily through the evening hour. The oil lamp on the shelf has not been lit all day, the natural light having been sufficient for every task, but now with the window darkening to a deep grey and the shadows claiming the corners of the room, he reaches for the lamp and lifts it down. The lamp is a simple thing of brass and glass, its reservoir half full of oil, its wick trimmed and ready. He strikes a spark with the flint and steel that lie beside the lamp, a single sharp click that produces a brief shower of light, and the wick catches with a small flame that dances for a moment and then steadies into a soft yellow glow. He adjusts the wick with the small brass knob until the flame is even and smokeless, and then he holds the lamp up and looks around the shop one more time, the warm light throwing long shadows that sway gently as his hand moves. The room is in order, everything in its place, everything ready for the night. He carries the lamp to the bucket in the corner behind the door and lifts the lid to check the level of the contents, noting that the bucket is perhaps a quarter full and will need emptying in a day or two, but not tonight. The lid settles back into place with a firm press, and he makes a mental note that is barely a thought, more a small adjustment in the back of his mind that will resurface when the time comes. He then walks to the front door and pushes it fully open, stepping out into the cool air of the market square with the lamp held before him, and he pauses on the doorstep to empty the water from the pitcher into the gutter that runs along the front of the shop. The water splashes softly on the cobbles, a quick sound that is swallowed by the evening quiet, and the pitcher is light in his hand when he turns back inside. The market square, as he sees it in the brief moment before he closes the door, is almost empty now. The stalls long packed away, the traders return to their homes, the cobbles darkening with the onset of night. A single figure crosses the far side of the square, a dark shape against the darker stone, and then disappears into a lane without a sound. The windows of the inn across the way show a faint glow behind their leaded panes, and the smoke from its chimney rises in a thin, straight column against the deep blue of the evening sky. The signboard of the apothecary is still, its creak silenced for the night, and the oak tree in the churchyard stands black and motionless against the last pale band of light on the horizon. The barber surgeon takes all of this in with a single, unhurried glance, and then he steps back inside and lets the door fall shut, dropping the iron latch into place with a soft, final sound. Inside the shop, the lamp now provides the only light, a warm circle of yellow that illuminates the work table and the stool and the bare floorboards around them, leaving the corners in deep shadow and the ceiling in a gloom that softens the lines of the beams. The clock on the shelf continues its steady ticking, a sound that seems louder now that the door is closed and the square is sealed off, and the oil lamp burns with a slight hiss that is almost too soft to hear. The barber surgeon stands beside the work table for a while, his hands resting at his sides, his breathing slow and even, and he lets the stillness of the evening settle around him like a second coat. He is not tired in any urgent way, but there is a pleasant heaviness in his limbs that tells him the day has been long enough and that rest will be welcome when he finally climbs the stairs. He thinks back over the day, not in a focused or analytical way, but in a loose drift of memory that touches on the morning's preparation, the careful dressing of the strop, the stropping of the Fleam and the lancet, the sounds of the market square filtering through the door, the long, patient wait on the stool, the farmer's arrival and the slow letting of blood, the cleaning that followed, the amber light of the afternoon, and now this quiet closing, the strop hanging on its hook, the tools nestled in their derricked spock, that the tools told it to be air with that peen boy. It has been a good day, a day like many others, a day in which nothing much happened, and yet everything that needed to happen was done. He does not put this thought into words, does not even form it fully, but it is there beneath the surface of his awareness, a quiet satisfaction that needs no expression. He reaches for the small pottery jar on the shelf, the jar that holds the day's earnings, and he lifts it down and tips the coins into his palm, the silver sixpence from the farmer and a few coppers that were already there from previous days. He counts them slowly, his lips moving slightly with the numbers, and then he drops them back into the jar and returns it to the shelf. The money is not important to him in any grand sense, but it is part of the order of things, a small acknowledgement that the work has been done and the day has been spent in useful occupation. The fire in the small hearth at the back of the shop, which has been cold all day because the weather has been warm enough, remains unlit, and he will not trouble himself to kindle it now, when he will soon go upstairs to the room above where the evening fire has already been laid, and needs only a spark to come to life. He thinks of the room above, the low ceiling with its exposed beams, the small window that looks out over the rear yard, the chair by the hearth with its cushion of faded wool, the shelf of books that he has read many times and will read again, the bed in the corner with its goose-feather mattress and its clean linen sheets. The room is simple, as simple as the shop below it, but it is warm and it is his, and the thought of it draws him gently toward the stairs. He takes up the lamp and walks to the foot of the staircase that rises from the back corner of the shop, a narrow set of wooden steps that turn once at a small landing before reaching the upper floor. He pauses there, one hand on the rail, and he looks back into the shop for the last time, the lamp casting its glow across the work table, and the empty chair and the strop hanging on its hook beside the window. The room is still and quiet, the tools put away, the surface is clean, the air holding only the faint sense of tallow and oil, and the ghost of lavender from the drop he put on the Fleam hinge. Everything is ready for the morning, though the morning is still a whole night away, and the shop will wait in the darkness with the patience of a place that has waited through many nights and will wait through many more. The barber surgeon turns and climbs the stairs, his footsteps slow and even on the worn wood, the lamp held before him to light the way. The steps creak under his weight, a series of soft protests that are as familiar to him as the tick of the clock, and he counts them automatically without meaning to. The 7 steps to the landing, the turn, the 4 steps to the upper floor. The door at the top stands open, and he passes through it into the room above, where the air is warmer and the smell of old wood and clean linen welcomes him home. He sets the lamp on the mantel and crosses to the hearth, where he kneels and strikes another spark into the kindling, watching the small flame catch and grow and spread to the split logs that have been waiting since the morning. The fire lights the room with a warm, flickering glow that pushes back the shadows and makes the space feel inhabited, and the barber surgeon rises from the hearth and settles into his chair with a slow, deep exhale that is the last sound he will make before the night takes him. Downstairs, the shop stands in darkness, the window a faint grey rectangle against the deeper black of the wall, the strop a darker line against the plaster, the work table a pale shape in the centre of the room. The clock ticks on, measuring the hours that pass in silence, and the oil in the empty lamp cools slowly on the shelf. There is no movement, no sound except the steady wooden heartbeat of the clock, and the shop waits in perfect stillness for the morning light and the return of the barber surgeon, who will come down the stairs at dawn and take the strop from its hook and begin again the quiet work of sharpening, the same work he has done every day for as long as he can remember, the work that will carry him through the morning and into the afternoon and on to the next evening, a continuous, unbroken rhythm of leather and into the afternoon and on to the next evening.